Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. My guest on this episode is Ben Brown from the University of Missouri. Ben Brown is an agriculture extension economist with the University of Missouri's Extension Agriculture Business and Policy team. He routinely works with Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute as a part of his role leading farm-level and sectoral outreach initiatives. Ben is a native of western Missouri, growing up on a diversified row crop and cattle operation. He was active in 4-H and FFA, leading to his passion for his extension. He's got ties to K-State, received his undergraduate degree from Kansas State University in 2015 in Ag Econ and Agronomy, and got his master's from the University of Missouri, where he was a graduate assistant for FAPRI. Prior to joining Missouri, he was an associate professor of professional practice at the Ohio State University, leading farm management education in Ohio. So Ben focuses on U.S. farm policy, commodity markets, and farm finance. Ben, thanks for joining us on this podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And as you mentioned, I do have ties to Kansas, which I assume is going to be a relevant topic for our audience today. And very proud of my undergrad degree from K-State and try to get back to Manhattan as often as I can.
Yeah, so fill us in a little bit more on your background. Looks like you were raised on a farm in western Missouri. Tell us about your family's farm.
Yeah, so my family has a row crop and cattle operation, cow-calf operation, and we background cattle as well. My parents and my sister and brother-in-law still live right around there. I get home as often as I can to help out. It's a little bit easier to do that here in Columbia than when I was at Ohio State University in Columbus. So I try to make it back for some of the big labor demand seasons of the year. So planting, harvesting. I always say that when we're harvesting wheat in late May, early June, that's always a really busy time for our operation because we have cattle, so we need hay as well. And so it's always when we're baling hay and we're planting beans usually and trying to spray corn and harvest wheat, and plant double crop beans. So it's a busy time on our family's farm, and really enjoy the opportunity to have that connection to agriculture. I wish I could be there more often than I am, but I found a passion for teaching, and which isn't really surprising to people that know my family. I basically come from a family of teachers and farmers, and so it's a little poetic that I blended the two for my own career. Really enjoy engaging with producers across the country, and certainly here in Missouri through my extension role as well. But yeah, that's a little bit about our family farm. Over time, my parents have continued to grow the cattle operation a little bit. That was a strategic decision in some ways, just because our area has some great rolling hills for grass production, and we just found that was a really great diversified strategy for our operation, and certainly is working well right now.
So soft red winter wheat or hard red winter wheat on your farm?
Yeah, soft red winter wheat is the wheat of choice. There are, every once in a while, you'll see some people that'll try some hard red winter wheat if they can find a market for it. But when it comes to the bulk grains, most elevators in our area want to take that soft red winter wheat just because it's easier to handle logistically. Like I said, there's every once in a while you can usually find a buyer, sometimes in Kansas City, but sometimes even going south, millers that want to blend a little bit of a hard wheat. But most of our area is soft red winter wheat.
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be a good opportunity I think a lot of people listening to this have heard of FAPRI at the University of Missouri, but remind us what that entity does.
So the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute, also known as FAPRI, we've existed here at the University of Missouri for 41 years. We just started our 42nd year. And so we've been doing this a little while, but we were kind of created out of the farm financial crisis of the early 1980s. And during that period of time, there was not a whole lot of analysis that was being done to support the industry. USDA had a couple of divisions. ERS was kind of relatively new at that point as well, but there wasn't a great source of policy analysis in terms of if this policy is implemented, what does it do to the outlook for both planted acreage, prices, trade, what impacts does it have? And so during that period, there was an effort to form a forward-thinking policy analyst group. And so at the time, there was 3 institutions. There was the domestic row crops and cattle or livestock, not just cattle, but livestock here at the University of Missouri. There was an international division that modeled international markets out of Iowa State University. And then there was a group at Texas A&M, the Agriculture Food Policy Center, that handled farm level panels. So basically took our numbers, worked with individual producer panels across the country in different geographical locations of different size to estimate their impact. So that was kind of the initial iteration. Today, Iowa State has kind of morphed into our group here at the University of Missouri. We still have ties in the international markets today, still do international work kind of out of our Columbia office with a couple of partners elsewhere in the United States, Virginia Tech, University of Nevada, Reno. We work with those groups. And then our sister institution, the Agriculture and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M, still has their representative farm network across the country. We actively work with them. Members of our staff go on those visits and vice versa. And so we have a very close working relationship between our national aggregate numbers and then the farm panels that exist through the Texas A&M system. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's our network. We're not just a University of Missouri, even though this is where we're housed and this is where most of our team members live and work. We actively see crop producers, livestock producers in these panel operations across the country. We have 4 such panels of wheat growers in Kansas. We have a couple of livestock. We have a couple of feed grains in Kansas. We meet with those producers every 2 to 3 years. It just helps us have a better understanding of the market dynamics and just kind of even some of the local dynamics that face agriculture. And so when we go to DC and we're talking and doing policy analysis with legislators and ag committee members, we can kind of talk a little bit more granular about what's happening in different parts of the country. I should notice, and this is my final thing I'll say as I've kind of been rambling on here about us, but we don't create policy. So we're not a policy think tank. We don't pretend to be either. We really don't try to come up with new policies. Most of what we evaluate is coming to us from the Senate and House Ag Committee staff, or the legislators that are a part of those committees. But a lot of times their staff will hear from commodity groups or trade organizations about a specific proposal. And then those committee members, if there is political interest of moving forward with those proposals, those staff members will ask us to evaluate the policies, and we provide the analysis back to the committees. So we don't come up with the policy ideas, and we don't tell the committees what they should do. We just provide the impacts, and they get to make their own decisions. So we play very much in the space of what is happening across rural America, and then what will happen if said policy is enacted. So those are kind of the 2 spaces we play in. We don't design policy, and we don't tell people what to do. We just evaluate the options.
That's a great refresher on what you do. Are you affiliated with USDA at any level? Do they provide you any funding, or how are your operations managed?
So Congress provides finances for policy analysis. Again, that was kind of, in the 1980s, Congress decided that they needed more information about how the policies they were considering impacted production agriculture. Outside just a few years in the early 2000s, we have received money through congressional appropriations. So it does come from Congress through USDA to us. We do receive financial support from the University of Missouri. And then we have quite a few just past supporters, farmers that have found our work beneficial, industry groups that have found our work beneficial, that have, over time just donated money for us. For instance, we have what's called the Abner Womack Excellence in Agriculture Policy Fund. Abner Womack was our first director 42 years ago. Served as our director, so far the longest tenured director. And when he retired, there was an effort just to kind of build a fund to do some more outreach opportunities, because it's one of those things to where we do a lot of policy analysis, but so much of what we do is behind closed doors to where we don't talk about it, right? It's a congressional aide will send us an email saying, hey, we're thinking about this. We might run some numbers, and sometimes we already have it done, and then we'll package it in a way, send it back to them, and that's the last that it's ever mentioned. And so there was an effort 12 years ago when Abner retired, to find ways to be a little bit more public facing, just to kind of use some of our numbers and analysis in a way that helps producers understand what's going on. So we have an annual conference that we put together every year just to kind of go through numbers and our outlook. And we do some ag lender type programs to train lenders in the fall. And so some of those things are more public facing, and we receive financial support to help cover the cost of those from partners and producers alike.
You do some good work. I saw your presentation at the Kansas Commodity Classic a few months ago in Salina, and great information. Tell us about your time at K-State. I imagine in 2015 you were a student of the great Barry Flinchbaugh, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Kansas State. I went out of state to school, and that was a big deal in my family because the rest of my family was Mizzou Tiger fans. And so for me to go to Kansas was kind of a shock, I think, to some people. But I loved my time at K-State, made some great friends, some friendships that I maintain today and I talk with quite regularly. And so the opportunity to come out when the request was made, or when the ask was made to see if I'd be willing to come to Kansas, it wasn't a hard decision to say yes. And so I got to come out, reconnect with some people I hadn't seen since graduation 12 years ago or 11 years ago. You asked about my time. I was a TA for Dr. Flinchbaugh. He was retired, but still teaching the undergrad course in agriculture policy at the time. So I got the I took the class and then got the TA for him. In some way, I don't know if he just recognized my potential as an extension educator or if it was a friendship that we built by being his TA. I'm not really sure exactly, and I wish I could ask him today. These are always the questions you think about later in life about how things come about. But I wish I could ask him if he saw potential in me as an extension educator, because he invited me and encouraged me to go along with him as he was doing his speeches across Kansas. So again, he was retired, but he was still giving presentations for different bank groups and different commodity organizations. And so I would get to go along with him to a lot of small towns in Kansas that I'd never heard of, because keep in mind, I'm not from Kansas, and met a lot of really, really great people through that. Can't help but wonder where my career would be today if I didn't get exposed to extension in that form. And so I try to remember that when I'm working with my own students here at the University of Missouri, that extension isn't necessarily a career path many people think about, but certainly can be really rewarding, and I've enjoyed my experience. So that was a very notable moment during my K-State career. The other thing, I would say, two other things I would say that were notable during my K-State career. One, I joined Alpha Gamma Rho. So that was a fraternity that was based in agriculture and still is. And I value that experience deeply and very appreciative. It opened some doors for me in the ag space that I really, really appreciate, and deep friendships as well. But one of those, so that's the first part of that. And then the second part, the other experience I had at K-State that kind of shaped me was I had the opportunity to go with some fraternity brothers to Brazil and do a study abroad experience for a month. And through that process, learned a ton that frankly, Brazil has become a huge topic of interest for producers. And so to think back to my experience in South America has been incredibly beneficial, but it's also just helped me highlight the importance of international study abroad. So every dollar I give to Kansas State and to the University of Missouri goes to help support students studying abroad. It's a big world out there, and we have a lot to learn, and just kind of what happens elsewhere impacts us here in the United States too. Those were the three big notable areas of my undergrad experience.
It's timely that you brought up Brazil. I spent 2 weeks in Brazil 2 years ago for a study trip, and the next Kansas Ag-Rural Leadership class is going to Brazil for their study trip. And boy, you are correct. The impact that country is going to have on the future of North American and global agriculture is very impactful, and we can talk about that too here in a little bit. I will say I think Flinchbaugh did rub off on you a little bit, having seen your presentation style in a good way. Yeah, I can see what he saw in you for your extension. You're doing a great job. Well, let's dive into some issues here, Ben. I mean, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of haziness in the farm economy right now. You know, uncertainty with tariffs, inflation, interest rates. You just recently released, again, your recent Farm Outlook report. So What are some of the tidbits of that report? It looks like we're going to have a really big corn crop. Wheat often tends to follow corn, so give us your synopsis.
I would say the high-level results from our annual baseline outlook are continued pressure, financial pressure in the row crop industry. Some row crops facing more dire financial conditions than others. So, when we look at cotton and rice in particular, both of those crops facing extreme financial pressures just because, really differing reasons for both of those crops. For cotton, almost 80% of our U.S. cotton crop is exported into Southeast Asia. And so there's two factors that come out when we talk about that crop in particular. Is one, the economy in Southeast Asia, absent of tariffs and anything else, is significantly weaker today than what we've seen at any point during the last decade. And so that's just lowered the overall demand for product. And then you throw in on top of that, the trade tariffs and the kind of the non-tariff barriers that we've also seen. So by the non-tariff barriers, I'm talking about some of the shipping fees that have been proposed, and even the challenges of moving product across the world through canals and the cost of docking ships. Those really impact highly exportable commodities like cotton. And so as a result, cotton prices and returns have been extremely low, and we've seen some cotton producing areas move away from cotton into corn, for instance. So, that's partially what's helping add in those added corn acres. Rice has got its own story as well, but the financial returns there are pressured. Normally when we see rice returns get pressured, that favors additional soybean acres. And so we did see a few more soybean acres in rice producing states, a little bit less soybeans planted in the upper plains states where we've seen a lot of growth in soybean acres. But broadly speaking, I'm kind of talking around all this the story for corn is additional corn acres. And that's come at the expense of many of our other crops. Grain sorghum had a surprising increase in acreage as well, and certainly you all out in Kansas are familiar with this. But the returns for grain sorghum are also struggling. It's a crop that has struggled, but the outlook earlier this year was for a very dry summer. And grain sorghum, it's cheaper to plant, it's more drought resilient. And so I think, when we think about expectations for a crop, grain sorghum picked up some additional acres in there, even though the returns are weak, right? So you add in extra corn acres and the yield is still yet to be determined. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that, because our forecast that we assume for corn yield is just a straight trend line yield. We haven't hit the national corn trend yields 7 years in a row. That's a point of contention for a lot of producers out there of is the trend yield even viable anymore? And it's always a topic of discussion. You got extra corn acres, yield maybe still yet to be determined. You've got extra grain sorghum acres, potentially putting more grain sorghum on the market at a time when grain sorghum demand is quite a bit lower than what we've seen. Again, some of our international buyers aren't really buying as much grain sorghum. We're feeding a lot more of that grain sorghum. And so that combination of added corn, added sorghum, also continues to put pressure on our wheat market as well. And the big storyline for wheat the last couple of years, as many people know, is the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what that does to global supplies of wheat. We've seen a lot of wheat come out of that region, even amidst all this global tension and the war that we've seen right there. And so we've seen a lot of wheat come out, and so it's even a question of, what does that conflict mean to wheat supplies? It was expected that we'd see a lot less wheat on the market than what we did. A little bit uncertainty there. My short point of this when it comes to the grain crops is continued consolidation. On the livestock side, cattle returns are incredibly strong. Pork is maybe a little bit better than what we had seen the last couple of years, and poultry's benefiting from disease outbreaks, shrinking supply. So if you're a producer with poultry and you're not facing disease pressure, or you haven't had to liquidate your flock due to disease, you're probably seeing some pretty good returns. If you're one of those producers that has been impacted by disease, it's kind of acute pain here. But that's kind of the high level takeaways, and we can dive in any way of that you would like. But that's the market side. And then on the policy side, just kind of one point is we've seen very large relatively large government payments the last couple of years that have kind of made up the financial shortfall. Not all of the way in some areas and more of the way in other areas of the country. And so, as we look to 2025, we've already seen $10 billion of economic assistance roll out. We're waiting on $20 billion in disaster aid, which, truthfully, Kansas might see a sizable portion of that disaster aid when it does finally get announced. So government payments could be and are expected to be large again in 2025. And with the absence of that, we'd be even worse off than where we are. But it's something that always a variable in terms of how it's going to be rolled out and how it'll impact the individual producers just based on the policy design.
How are those government payments, the ones we know about now, keeping the net farm income? What's that trend line look like?
At least from our estimate on a national perspective, the added government assistance that we know of and that are expected actually creates a scenario to where it's the third highest net farm income that we've seen in history, and that follows 2 really strong years. Now, again, that's all net income, or that's all commodities, so cattle receipts are certainly helping buoy those farm income numbers as well. But government payments the last few years have been sizable. It was not that long ago that half of the farm income was made up from government payments. Just, I guess that would be 5 years ago. And we've maintained a rather strong level of government payments ever since then. And so there's kind of a question of, how much is needed? Is there a means test that's needed? You always hear people talk about payment caps. Of course, there's evidence to suggest that payment caps are pretty ineffective. There's kind of legal ways around those as well. But the economic assistance payments at $10 billion that we saw here in 2025 already, there wasn't a whole lot of provisions. If you planted an acre of corn, you were guaranteed a payment per acre. It did have a payment cap on it, but same way with all the other crops. There was a payment associated for every planted acre, regardless if you did risk management, regardless if you had crop insurance indemnities. And so, it was pretty blanketed across, and it always comes down to fairness. If I manage my crop and I didn't have any economic losses, I feel like I did the right thing and I should be rewarded. Some people would say, well, you didn't have an economic loss, so therefore you don't need a payment. So that's kind of the 2 sides of that coin that policymakers always have to consider. But, this last round didn't really have a whole lot of limitations to it.
Touch on tariffs a little bit more. That sorghum dynamic is interesting. There are country elevators in Kansas right now not taking bids for sorghum, and even the projected acres number being up. So there are crops that are more sensitive to tariffs, obviously, right? We export a lot of wheat from Kansas, export a lot of corn and sorghum, but our wheat exports have been doing fairly well, haven't they? What are the factors involved in that?
Tariffs and the trade discussion broadly is something that it's a ever evolving process, and it's coming at a time to where we've seen tariffs be placed on countries, and then some of them have been rolled back depending on the commodities. We also have all these non-tariff barriers that are kind of starting to pop up as well. So I mentioned the ship fee ones, but like for our bulk grains, the early concern was that there would be a tariff or a tax applied to commodities that were being shipped in bulk carriers, ocean-going vessels. Some of that concern has been alleviated as now the U.S. government has said that we will allow shipments to come in, or we will allow a waive of that tax if the ships come in empty. And so that good news for us in the bulk grain space is a good proportion, a high proportion of our ships that are transporting grains, bulk grains, come in empty into the United States. And so we've been able to avoid that for some aspects. When it comes to trade, China, you mentioned grain sorghum. Grain sorghum is largely shipped to China and Mexico. We've had kind of off and on relations with Mexico. China has been, kind of the headliner here, and we have very high tariffs placed on China to the point where it's basically priced us out of the market, which is why I think a lot of your country elevators that you mentioned for grain sorghum just aren't taking bids. There's a big concern of if we do buy it, what do we do with it after we buy it? That's one side of this. Now, you asked the question about how is overall shipments of product looking today, and we have seen a scenario to where sales of commodities have performed a little better than what many people had anticipated. There's a kind of a reason for that, in the fact that Feed grains were tight in the global market. There's not a lot of alternative spaces to go to get feed grains outside than the United States. And so that's allowed buyers like Mexico to continue to buy corn from the United States. It's allowed us to see wheat shipments continue to find homes in international markets as well. So, it's kind of a unique storyline, as there's a lot of people that would say, oh, we should start seeing trade kind of start to slow down. But the opposite's kind of happened. We've seen trade remain resilient, plus maybe even a little bit stronger than where we would have expected it to. Specifically to wheat, each wheat class has its own story to kind of tell, but I'll just highlight a couple. So for all wheat together, we're 3% higher than our season average pace needed in total commitments. Now that's been shipped, plus that has been sold but has not yet shipped, so we'd consider that outstanding sales. The hard red spring category is 17%, so a good chunk of that's being driven by the hard red spring wheat. Hard red winter wheat, which you all grow out in Kansas and kind of the southern plains, is 8% better. So again, we've seen different aspects of wheat, find homes in international markets, even with all this trade tension out there. Grain sorghum's the one that's struggling. We're 50% below our season pace needed. So grain sorghum's kind of the one that's holding the feed grain market down in the trade space.
Curious, do you track in FAPRI, do you track the dollar? Have any projections on that?
We do, yeah. So, the dollar's been the headline story here as of late because it's dropped so much. Now, I'll remind people that it's able to drop so much. It's just like cattle markets, right? Like there's more downside in cattle markets right now because the price for cattle is high. The same thing was true with the US dollar. Our US dollar relative to other currencies around the world was very strong. And so there was a lot of downside potential to that dollar. We expected some softness in the market heading into the year, or, like when all of this started the last couple of months, we had already baked in a little softness in the US dollar this year, but we've seen a lot more deterioration in the US dollar index than what our analysis would have expected, just because it's hard to predict what's going to happen in this trade front, right? We made no assumptions about trade ahead of the tariff announcements because, to make an assumption would make you look like a fool, frankly, in this environment. So we had some softness already baked in for the US dollar. Of course, with all the trade announcements, it's really caused the dollar to fall pretty sharply. And that's made our products a little bit more cheaper on the international market. That would be my answer, is if we took into account all of our analysis again today with where the dollar index, we would see a little bit higher export sales than what we currently expect. But I think the other side of this is we'd probably, again, without making a forecast, we're not sure the US dollar can stay this low relative to other countries through the rest of the calendar year.
Yeah, good information there. We mentioned Brazil earlier. We should talk about crop inputs a little bit. So what are, in your mind, some of the key differences between profitability in Brazil versus the U.S.? Inputs, fixed costs, variable costs, things like that.
So I'll tell you a story, and then we'll kind of talk about input costs as well. But when I was in Brazil in January of 2015, that's when I stayed down there, which their growing season's opposite of us. So that was the heart of their growing season in January. Brazil hadn't really emerged in the global market space as a dominant producer. I think there were producers in the United States that recognized the potential of Brazil, but it was still relatively unknown, right? Like, we were down there, and while we were down there, I think we had this aha moment of like, hey, these people are going to become dominant producers, just in the way they talked, their strategy about things. The concern was their infrastructure, and we just felt like, hey, if they could get their infrastructure figured out, like, this is going to be a major boon to their industry. And that's basically what happened. I was there in 2015, and by 2018, 2019, they had grown so much that all of a sudden you started seeing producers in the United States wanting to know what's happening in Brazil. And they became, the largest exporter of soybeans. They've become a dominant exporter of corn, or I shouldn't say dominant. They've become a large exporter of corn. They've become a large exporter of cotton now as well. And so that was the initial wave. The second wave that I want to tee up here is, in the last year, there's been a lot of producers in the United States ask me, Ben, why does Brazil continue to expand production when, like, we're getting the markets? If we're in a global market and we're getting the incentive to cut acres, why is Brazil continuing to see an increase why are they continuing to increase acres? And the answer really does come down to economics. There's a little bit of currency exchange in this as well. When I was there, one US dollar converted to about 2.7 Brazilian reals. They sell soybeans on the Chicago Board of Trade in US dollars and then convert them to reals. And so just from an input standpoint, they were getting 27 Brazilian reals for every bushel of corn. Fast forward to today, one bushel of, I should back up and say that soybeans were trading at $10 a bushel in January 2025 or 2015. And so that's how they were getting 27 reals for every bushel of soybeans. Fast forward to today, soybeans are more or less $10. They're a little higher than that on the Board of Trade right now. But, let's just say $10 still. One US dollar, just a little bit more than 6 Brazilian reals. And so they're getting $60 or 60 Brazilian reals for every bushel of soybeans. So they doubled their price during that 10-year period of time. And yes, their input costs have gone up, but their output price continues to signal to them that there's more soybeans needed on the global market when it's really just a currency exchange more so than an actual global tightness in the soybean or the oilseed markets. So that's the output price side. Now let's talk about the input cost side. They beat us on the fixed cost. Point and simple, it's the fixed cost that they really whack us on. They learned from us in some ways in terms of how to use equipment. They saw all these custom harvest crews that worked their way through the plain states, and they implemented that on broad spokes of their prime growing region. So it's able to spread that fixed cost out over more acres, have a smaller machinery cost per acre, and then their land costs are lower. They double crop acreage. They continue to bring more acreage into production, and so as a result, their land rents and land costs, while growing, still are not as high as what ours are. And so it's the fixed costs that they beat us on. Their variable costs are pretty similar to ours, actually. Different categories have a different impacts. Transportation, as we mentioned, is a higher cost for them than it is for us, but they have a little bit lower labor costs and other types of things like that too. So the variable cost side, pretty even. It's the fixed costs that is hard to manage, or it's hard to correct. I do think we as U.S. producers can learn from them a little bit on their machinery utilization. They learned from us, and we kind of went to a space where every farmer had every piece of equipment they needed on their farm. There are some exceptions, but their way of doing machinery sharing is certainly helping them keep their machinery costs lower.
Well, that's some great insight there. Yeah, Brazil is a fascinating place, and I encourage people, if you get a chance to visit, please do that. Before we wrap up, Ben, we should talk a little bit about farm policy. I don't know if you have a crystal ball, but what are the latest whisperings you're hearing about the Farm Bill?
From a farm policy standpoint, there's some conversations being had about a farm bill. However, the environment to pass a farm bill is still a long ways away. There's still a lot of conversations that need to be had. Most of them relate to budget. We're seeing a section of the legislators that really want to focus in cutting budgets. The other section of legislators wants to improve the federal safety net for farmers, and that's going to cost more money. So you've got an environment to where people want to increase costs of the farm bill at the same time. A large portion, or I shouldn't say a large portion, a significant portion of legislators want to find efficiencies and cut expenditures, and that's just creating this environment to where people can't agree, and so it's just kind of floating for the time being. I will tell you, and telling your listeners, that watching the tax bill that's coming up and it's going to be working its way through Congress, watch that to see if there's ways that the quote unquote ag committee members can get their expenditure provisions included there. For instance, there's been some talk about adding additional funding through that process to the Farm Bill to help make writing the Farm Bill a little easier. Again, that's far from certain. There's a lot of challenges that will still exist. Getting a tax bill through Congress alone is going to be a challenge, and so it's possible that we don't see any farm provisions included in that bill by the end of this. But that would certainly help get the Farm Bill finished, if the goal is to actually get the Farm Bill finished. The second thing is, we could be in a period of time to where we see another ad hoc support program. I'm certainly not expecting it, because nothing, it's not policy, and I think a lot of people would like to see them get a Farm Bill through. But we could be in an environment very similar to where we were last year without an update to the Farm Bill, and then some need for financial assistance that makes its way through an end-of-year spending package again. So wouldn't rule that out. I think it's difficult to see a farm bill getting through Congress this cycle.
The administration's hands are kind of tied. If they have the will to issue some more checks to farmers, last go around with some CCC money, what are their options limited to?
One of the challenges with CCC is it's kind of like a revolving operating account. You spend money out of it, and then it has to get replenished at different points of the year. So during the trade war, or trade spat in 2018, USDA provided payments in 2019 to farmers using the Commodity Credit Corporation. That still exists as an avenue today. However, where it sits right now is there's not a whole lot. And when I say not a whole lot, we're talking about a couple of billion rather than the billions, the tens of billions that have been talked about in trade assistance. There's a couple of billion freed up and available in there. So USDA could ask Congress, and will ask Congress at some point, to replenish that fund just like they do every year. There is a question or political optics of, will legislators broadly be willing to do that if they know that the administration is going to use that again for trade aid payments? And so there might be some stipulations that put on there. There might not be. And getting that fund replenished may be a challenge as well. So I wouldn't rule it out, because it's always, it's something just to follow. But even if that program isn't available, or there's not enough money in that program, I certainly think that USDA would find ways to pay producers through other channels, through other mechanisms, if they wanted to move forward with trade aid assistance payments. The most clear-cut way is just through the CCC. It runs and is the checking account more or less for all of our farm program payments, operating loans that go through FSA, ownership loans through FSA, marketing loans, dairy payments, all those go through there. And so there is, an annual kind of process to replenish that fund. And it would just be interesting to see if there's any stipulations by Congress put onto that account to prevent being used as trade assistance.
Yeah, one last question on farm policy, and I think I saw this in one of your publications, but PLC and ARC, we're starting to get some of these lower revenue years in there and toss out some of the higher ones. So how does that impact?
This is a topic where I would tell people and listeners, hearing what national people like me, like I'm sitting here talking to, you all in Kansas, and I'm very familiar with our situation here in Missouri, and certainly talk to producers in other parts of the country, right? Like I might sit here and say, okay, it looks like, we're going to see some PLC payments. Well, that might be true, and certainly provide, national payments, because that is kind of a national program. It triggers when a national price gets low enough. But there's other parts of the country where ARC payments might exceed that or be higher than the PLC payments. And so I always tell people to look at your situation, try to run the numbers in your situation, because while somebody might be talking nationally and might say, hey, this is what it looks like, that might not necessarily be the case. But broadly, I think what I can say across the thing is, yes, we are seeing lower prices. We're coming off some higher income yields, whether that be, or years, whether that be prices or yields, or a combination of the two in some parts. Especially if you had a good yield at any point during the last couple of years, you've got a high revenue benchmark, and so that's going to trigger some ARC County payments. And so I do think as we move ahead the next couple of years, we'll see some higher levels of ARC and PLC payments in aggregate together than what we've seen the last couple of years.
That's some great advice, Ben. And if farmers, I know FAPRI has a lot of resources, calculators, information available for farmers. What's the best way to find that?
Yeah, so we do try to put everything on the website where we can. So FAPRI@Missouri.edu is kind of one of the tools. However, I would tell you that sometimes we just aren't quick in getting stuff on the website. It's a matter of fighting the biggest fire, and sometimes the biggest fire is the one that's right in front of your face. And so, sometimes the website gets, I wouldn't say neglected, but sometimes we just forget to finish the process. So if a producer ever needs anything, they're welcome to reach out to me at BP Brown. So B as in boy, P as in pig, and then the color brown spelled out @Missouri.edu. I'm happy to help facilitate that discussion and get resources that you need, or just kind of say, hey, here's another source of information to consider as well.
Ben, thanks a lot for being with us on this episode. Really appreciate the good information you shared.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ben Brown for joining us on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have a follow-up question for Ben, or Have a suggestion for a future topic to cover? Please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.